Today, we're going to witness one of the most audacious and ultimately tragic military operations of World War II. It was a plan so bold, so ambitious, that success would have ended the war by Christmas 1944. Instead, it became a devastating lesson in the limits of military planning and the price of overconfidence. Picture this, September 17, 1944. The largest airborne armada in history darkens the skies over Holland. Over 1,500 transport aircraft and 500 gliders carrying 35,000 elite paratroopers and glider troops. Their mission? To seize a series of bridges across the Netherlands in a single, coordinated assault that would punch a hole straight through German defenses and into the heart of the Reich itself. For 9 days, these brave men would fight against impossible odds in what would become known as a bridge too far. The operation that showcased both the incredible courage of Allied airborne forces and the tragic consequences of flawed planning and underestimated enemies. This is the story of Operation Market Garden, where American paratroopers would leap into enemy fire to capture crucial bridges, where British glider pilots would crash land their flying coffins behind enemy lines, and where an entire airborne division would make its last stand in the streets of a Dutch town called Arnhem. It's a story of heroism and heartbreak, of victories that felt like defeats, and defeats that somehow contained the seeds of ultimate victory. But to understand how this daring gamble unfolded, we must first step into the mind of the man who conceived it. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a commander whose confidence would both inspire and doom thousands of young men to their fate in the Dutch countryside. The architect of audacity. By September 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had been nothing short of spectacular. The DI landings in Normandy had succeeded beyond all expectations. Paris had been liberated, and German forces were in full retreat toward their homeland. For many Allied commanders, it seemed that Nazi Germany was on the verge of total collapse. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, was convinced that the war could be won before the end of 1944 if the Allies acted with sufficient boldness. Montgomery was a complex figure, methodical and cautious in some operations, yet capable of breathtaking audacity when he sensed opportunity. Market Garden would represent the most ambitious gamble of his entire career. The strategic situation seemed to favor a bold stroke. German forces in the Netherlands appeared demoralized and disorganized, retreating in disorder after their catastrophic defeat in the Falaise Pocket. Allied intelligence suggested that the Wehrmacht was a broken force, incapable of mounting serious resistance to a determined Allied advance. Montgomery's plan was elegant in its simplicity and staggering in its scope. Operation Market Garden would consist of two components. Market would be the largest airborne operation in history, with 3.5 airborne divisions seizing a series of bridges across the Netherlands. Garden would be a lightning armored thrust by British the 30th Corps, racing along a single road to link up with the airborne forces and cross the Rhine River into Germany itself. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commanding the 1st Allied Airborne Army, summarized the plan's ambition during a planning conference. We're going to lay down a carpet of airborne troops 64 miles long from Eindhoven to Arnhem. If it works, we'll be across the Rhine and into the Ruhr within a week. If it fails, he paused, studying the map. Well, gentlemen, failure is not an option. But even as Browning spoke those confident words, he was harboring private doubts about the operation's feasibility. The famous exchange between Montgomery and Browning would later become legendary. When Montgomery pointed to the bridge at Arnhem, the most distant objective, Browning reportedly said, "I think we might be going a bridge too far, sir." Montgomery dismissed the concern with characteristic confidence. The impossible plan. The complexity of Operation Market Garden was breathtaking. 3 separate airborne divisions would land simultaneously across a 64-mile corridor in the Netherlands. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Maxwell Taylor, would seize bridges around Eindhoven. In the south, the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, under Brigadier General James Gavin, would capture the crucial bridges at Nijmegen in the center. Most ambitious of all, the British First Airborne Division, led by Major General Roy Urquhart, would drop near Arnhem and seize the bridge over the Rhine River, the final barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland. Supporting them would be the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade under General Stanislaw Sosabowski, a unit that had already endured 5 years of exile and war. The ground component, Operation Garden, would be led by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, commanding British the 30th Corps. Horrocks, a charismatic and experienced commander who had served under Montgomery since the North African campaign, would lead an armoured spearhead up a single road through the Dutch countryside, linking up with each airborne division in sequence and ultimately crossing the Rhine at Arnhem. The timeline was impossibly tight. The 30th Corps would have to advance 64 miles in less than 4 days, fighting through whatever German resistance they encountered while maintaining the precise schedule needed to relieve the airborne forces before they were overwhelmed. Any significant delay would doom the paratroopers to destruction. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne, understood the risks better than most. At his final briefing, he told his officers, "Gentlemen, this operation will either end the war by Christmas or cost us our entire division. We are jumping deeper behind enemy lines than any airborne force has ever attempted, and will be holding our objectives for longer than any airborne division was ever designed to operate. Every man needs to understand that relief might not come, and if it doesn't, we fight to the last round." The gathering storm. As September 17th dawned clear and bright across southern England, the largest airborne armada in history began to take shape from dozens of airfields, transport aircraft and gliders loaded with elite troops, equipment, and supplies. The sight was awe-inspiring. Over 1,500 C-47 transport aircraft, 500 gliders, and nearly 1,000 fighter escorts darkening the skies. Private Gene Metcalf of the 82nd Airborne described the scene from inside his C-47. Looking out the windows, you could see aircraft as far as the horizon in every direction. Transports, gliders, fighters, the biggest air armada anyone had ever seen. The guys were nervous but excited. We'd been training for something like this since D-Day, and now we were finally going to do something that would really matter. Some of the older guys, the ones who jumped in Sicily and Normandy, they were quieter. They knew what was waiting for us on the ground. The aircrew were equally impressed by the scope of the operation. Flight Officer James D. Pietro, piloting a CG-4 glider loaded with troops and a jeep, later recalled, "We were part of something historic, and everyone knew it. But as we approached the Dutch coast, you could see the flak starting to come up. Little black puffs at first, then more and more, until the sky ahead looked like a thunderstorm. That's when the reality hit. We were flying into hell, and not everyone was coming back." The flight across the North Sea was largely uneventful, but as the massive formation approached the Dutch coast, German anti-aircraft fire began to take its toll. Transport aircraft and gliders began falling from the sky, their crews and passengers lost before they ever reached their objectives. That's when the reality hit. We were flying into hell, and not everyone was coming back. The flight across the North Sea was largely uneventful, but as the massive formation approached the Dutch coast, German anti-aircraft fire began to take its toll. Transport aircraft and gliders began falling from the sky, their crews and passengers lost before they ever reached their objectives. The flak was getting heavier as we approached the landing zones. You could hear it hitting the aircraft around us, see the smoke trails from the ones that had been hit. My co-pilot kept looking at me, waiting for orders, but what could I tell him? We had our job to do, and we were going to do it, no matter what was waiting for us on the ground. Hell's Highway. The first Allied paratroopers to land were the men of the 101st Airborne Division. Jumping onto fields and farmland around Eindhoven, their mission was to secure the southern end of the corridor, capturing bridges over several canals and rivers while establishing a secure base for the 30th Corps advance. The initial drops went better than expected. German resistance was light, and most of the division's key objectives were secured. Within hours of landing, the famous Screaming Eagles of the 101st, already legends from the Normandy campaign, would add to their reputation in the Netherlands. However, the operation's first major setback came almost immediately, at best, a small town near Eindhoven. A single company of paratroopers ran into an entire German battalion defending a crucial bridge. What should have been a simple objective became a bloody battle that would last for days. Private Joey Mann exemplified the heroism that would characterize the entire operation. During the fighting near Best, Mann crawled within bazooka range of a German artillery emplacement that was devastating his unit. Single-handedly, he destroyed the position, then began methodically picking off German soldiers with his rifle. Despite being wounded in both shoulders and one arm by enemy fire, Mann refused evacuation. His platoon sergeant later recalled, "Joe was bleeding badly, couldn't use one arm at all, but he insisted on standing guard through the night. Said he could still shoot with one hand, and his eyes were fine." That's the kind of man we had in the 101st guys who just wouldn't quit, no matter what. The fighting around Eindhoven quickly took on a desperate character. German forces, initially caught off guard by the airborne assault, began to recover and counterattack. Sapper Alan W. Gauntlet described the chaotic scene. There were beautiful houses and lovely gardens along the way, many damaged by shelling, and the owners came out waving and cheering us as liberators. Sadly, they were soon to be disappointed and left to their fate. Also along the road were blown-up jeeps, wagons, and German armored vehicles, many with their dead drivers still inside. It was all too much to take in. Somehow, it didn't seem real. Thunder from heaven, the 82nd at Nijmegen, north of Eindhoven, the 82nd Airborne Division faced an even more challenging mission. Brigadier General James Gavin's paratroopers had to secure the bridges at Nijmegen, including the massive road and rail bridge over the Vol River. This bridge was perhaps the most crucial objective in the entire operation. Without it, the 30th Corps could never reach Arnhem. The drop zones were closer to German defensive positions than those of the 101st, and resistance was immediately fierce. German anti-aircraft guns ringing Nijmegen opened fire on the transport aircraft as they approached, and several planes were shot down before their paratroopers could jump. Private Jean Metcalf landed in a meadow that was surrounded by German anti-aircraft positions. His account captures the terrifying reality of jumping into combat. "I hit the ground hard, and immediately heard machine gun fire all around me. The Germans had spotted our drop zones and were waiting for us. I spent the first hour crawling through a drainage ditch, trying to get away from the landing zone without getting shot. When I finally made it to a farmhouse, I found 3 other guys from my stick. 2 of them were wounded, and we had no idea where we were or where our unit was." The situation became even more desperate when intelligence reports confirmed the presence of German SS Panzer units in the Nijmegen area. Elite troops with tanks and heavy weapons that had not been detected by Allied reconnaissance. The 82nd found themselves fighting not demoralized garrison troops, but some of the best soldiers in the German army. Despite the overwhelming opposition, the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne displayed the kind of courage that had made them legendary. The assault on the Nijmegen Bridge would become one of the most heroic actions of the entire war. By September 20th, 3 days into the operation, the 30th Corps had fought its way north from Eindhoven and linked up with the 82nd Airborne at Nijmegen. However, the crucial bridge over the Vol River remained in German hands, and German defensive positions on the north side of the river were so strong that a frontal assault seemed impossible. The solution was audacious beyond belief. 26 small assault boats would carry paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne across the fast-flowing Vol River in broad daylight directly under the guns of German defenders. Once across, the paratroopers would assault the bridge from the rear while British tanks attacked from the south. The crossing was a nightmare of fire and blood. German machine guns, mortar, and artillery pieces concentrated their fire on the small boats as they struggled across the 400-yard width of the river. Many boats were hit and sunk, their occupants killed or drowned in the swift current. Lieutenant John Thompson, commanding one of the assault boats, described the crossing. "The water was churning with machine gun bullets and exploding mortar rounds. You could hear the rounds hitting the water all around us, see the splashes where they struck. Guys were getting hit and falling into the river. Some of the boats just disappeared. Direct hits from mortar or artillery. But we kept going because we had to. The bridge had to be taken. Despite losing over 200 men in the crossing, the survivors of the 82nd Airborne successfully reached the north bank and began their assault on the German defensive positions. Fighting house by house and street by street, they gradually worked their way toward the bridge approaches. The coordinated assault succeeded. As American paratroopers attacked from the north and British tanks advanced from the south, German resistance began to crumble. By late afternoon, on September 20th, the Great Bridge at Nijmegen was in Allied hands. But the victory came too late. Every hour of delay had given German forces more time to prepare their defenses around Arnhem. The British First Airborne Division, holding out under increasingly desperate circumstances, would have to wait even longer for relief. Arnhem, the farthest bridge. Of all the objectives in Operation Market Garden, Arnhem represented both the greatest prize and the greatest risk. The bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem was the gateway to Germany itself. Capture it and the war might indeed be over by Christmas. Fail to take it and the entire operation would be for nothing. The British First Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Roy Urquhart, was tasked with this crucial mission. The division included some of the most experienced airborne troops in the British Army. Veterans of campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. If anyone could succeed in such a desperate mission, it would be these elite soldiers. But from the moment the first paratroopers landed near Arnhem, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The landing zones were 8 miles from the bridge, much farther than anyone had wanted, but chosen to avoid German anti-aircraft defenses. This meant that the paratroopers would have to fight their way through the city of Arnhem itself before they could even attempt to capture their objective. Radio communications failed almost immediately. The radio sets that were supposed to link the airborne forces with each other and with the 30th Corps simply didn't work in the urban environment around Arnhem. Units became separated and lost, unable to coordinate their actions or call for support. Most catastrophically of all, German resistance was far stronger than anyone had anticipated. Instead of the demoralized garrison troops that intelligence had predicted, the paratroopers found themselves facing elite SS Panzer divisions that had been refitting in the Arnhem area. These were experienced, well-equipped troops with tanks, artillery, and the determination to fight to the death. Major Charles Panzer, serving with the 1st Airborne, captured the growing desperation in his diary. We received a message that the forward elements of the 2nd Army were on their way with orders to hold on the men. By now, we're very tired, having had practically no sleep. The order was to fight on and hope for relief. Morale was high, but exhaustion was setting in fast. The last stand at Arnhem Bridge. Despite the overwhelming obstacles, a small force of British paratroopers did succeed in reaching the north end of Arnhem Bridge. Led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, approximately 600 men from the 2nd Parachute Battalion fought their way through the city and established defensive positions around the bridge approaches. For 4 days and nights, this tiny force held the north end of Arnhem Bridge against increasingly desperate German attacks. They were cut off from the rest of their division, running low on ammunition and medical supplies, and facing overwhelming enemy forces. Yet they refused to surrender. The fighting was savage and continuous. German forces attacked with tanks, flamethrowers, and artillery, trying to dislodge the paratroopers from their positions. The British responded with everything they had: anti-tank guns, mortar, and the incredible marksmanship that had made them feared throughout the German army. Lieutenant Colonel Frost himself was wounded on the 3rd day of the battle, but continued to command his men from a makeshift aid station. His determination became legendary among both his own troops and their German opponents. A German officer who attempted to negotiate a surrender was reportedly told by Frost, "We came here to take this bridge, and we're not leaving until we've done our job or died trying." Private accounts, fighting with the paratroopers at the bridge, described the desperate nature of the battle. "We all dived for cover and stayed there, eating dirt, until the fighter planes finished their attack. There was confusion all around with few officers to give orders. The only way was south, so in disarray we withdrew. With sniper fire and mortar shells all around, we started losing men, so we made a run for it. It was all too close for comfort. By September 21st, the position at the bridge had become untenable. Ammunition was running out, casualties were mounting, and German attacks were becoming more coordinated and effective. The surviving paratroopers were forced to withdraw from the bridge, ending any chance of securing the crossing. The cauldron trapped at Oosterbeek. As the situation at Arnhem Bridge deteriorated, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division found itself trapped in an increasingly small perimeter around the village of Oosterbeek. What had begun as an offensive operation had become a desperate struggle for survival. General Urquhart, the division commander, had been cut off from his headquarters for the first 2 days of the battle and was forced to hide in an attic while German patrols searched the house below. When he finally returned to his command post, he found his division scattered and under intense pressure from all sides. The perimeter at Oosterbeek became known as the Cauldron, a small pocket of British resistance surrounded by overwhelming German forces. Inside this shrinking perimeter, over 3,000 British and Polish paratroopers fought against impossible odds, holding out for the relief that they had been promised, but which never came. The fighting in the Cauldron was characterized by incredible acts of heroism and sacrifice. Glider pilots who had crash-landed their aircraft and were supposed to be evacuated instead took up rifles and fought as infantry. Medical personnel worked under constant fire to treat the wounded. Even Dutch civilians joined the battle, helping the paratroopers and caring for the wounded despite the mortal danger to themselves. Sergeant Frank Hughes, who had piloted a glider into Arnhem on his 20th birthday, found himself fighting as an infantryman in the streets of Oosterbeek. The young man who had expected to fly home after delivering his cargo instead, spent 9 days in hell, fighting against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources and reinforcements. An airborne major who eventually escaped the Cauldron later described the experience. Every day we expected relief. Every day we were told that the 30th Corps was just hours away. But the hours turned into days, and the days felt like years. Men were falling everywhere, some from enemy fire, some from exhaustion, some from wounds that would have been easily treatable in a proper hospital. We held on because we were British paratroopers, and that's what we do. But we all knew we were probably going to die in that place. The Polish sacrifice. As the situation at Arnhem became increasingly desperate, the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, commanded by General Stanislaw Susabowski, was finally committed to the battle. The Poles had been held in reserve, but with the British First Airborne Division facing annihilation, every available man was needed. The Polish drop on September 21st was a disaster from the start. German forces now knew exactly where the Allied landing zones were located and had positioned anti-aircraft guns to provide devastating covering fire. Many of the transport aircraft carrying the Polish paratroopers were shot down before they could drop their passengers. Those Poles who did manage to land found themselves in an impossible situation. They were supposed to reinforce the British forces at Arnhem, but the bridge was already lost and the British were trapped in the Oosterbeek perimeter. Instead of reinforcing success, the Poles found themselves adding to a growing catastrophe. General Susabowski, a veteran of the 1939 campaign against Germany and 5 years of exile warfare, understood the situation better than most of the British commanders. He had argued against the operation from the beginning, pointing out the numerous flaws in the plan and the likelihood of disaster. Now, as his men died in the Dutch countryside, his worst fears were being realized. The Polish paratroopers fought with the same courage and determination that had characterized their nation's resistance since 1939. Despite being dropped into a hopeless situation with inadequate support and equipment, they continued to fight, trying desperately to break through to their British allies. One Polish officer, interviewed years after the war, captured the futility of their situation. "We had been fighting the Germans for 5 years. We had lost our country, our homes, everything we held dear. And now we were being asked to die for a bridge in Holland that was already lost. But we were soldiers, and soldiers do their duty. We fought because it was all we knew how to do. The 30th Corps racing against time, while the airborne forces fought for their lives in the Netherlands. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks was leading the 30th Corps in a desperate race against time. The armored spearhead of Operation Garden was supposed to cover 64 miles in less than 4 days, an ambitious timeline. Then, under the best circumstances, the advance began promisingly. German resistance was initially light, and the leading tanks of the Guards Armored Division made good progress along the single road that connected all the airborne objectives. The road was quickly dubbed Hell's Highway by the troops who had to travel it under constant threat of German attack. But as the 30th Corps advanced deeper into German-held territory, resistance stiffened dramatically. The single road became a bottleneck that limited the corps to advancing in single file, making it vulnerable to ambushes and severely limiting the speed of advance. German forces, initially surprised by the scale of the Allied attack, began to organize effective counterattacks, aimed at cutting the narrow corridor. Colonel Joe Vanderlaar, commanding the Irish Guards Spearhead, described the challenges his tanks faced. We were advancing up a single road with ditches and soft ground on both sides. If the lead tank was knocked out, the entire column was stopped until we could push it off the road. The Germans knew exactly where we had to go, and they were waiting for us at every crossroads and bridge. It was like driving through a shooting gallery. The delays began to mount. What should have been a rapid advance became a series of costly battles for control of individual villages and road junctions. Each delay meant more time for German forces to reinforce their positions around Arnhem, and less chance that the airborne forces could be relieved in time. By September 21st, the 30th Corps had linked up with the 82nd Airborne at Nijmegen, and captured the crucial bridge over the Vol River. But they were still 20 miles short of Arnhem, and German resistance was growing stronger with every passing hour. On September 25, 8 days after the operation began, Lieutenant General Horrocks made one final attempt to reach the trapped paratroopers at Arnhem. A combined force of British tanks and Polish paratroopers would attempt to cross the lower Rhine south of Arnhem and establish a bridgehead that could be used to evacuate the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division. The attack was doomed from the start. German forces had had over a week to prepare their defenses and had positioned anti-tank guns and infantry in perfect positions to repel any river crossing attempt. The few tanks that managed to cross the river were quickly destroyed, and the supporting infantry suffered enormous casualties. General Sisebowski, commanding the Polish forces in this final assault, watched his remaining men cut down by German machine guns and mortar. After 5 years of war and exile, the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade was being destroyed in a hopeless attack on German positions that should never have been attempted. The failure of this final assault sealed the fate of Operation Market Garden. That night, the decision was made to evacuate the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division from the north bank of the Rhine. Operation Berlin, as the evacuation was codenamed, would attempt to bring out as many men as possible under cover of darkness. Operation Berlin, the Great Escape. The evacuation of the surviving paratroopers from Arnhem was carried out on the night of September 25 to 26, 1944. Using small boats and rafts, British and Canadian engineers ferried the exhausted survivors across the Rhine to safety. It was a dangerous operation carried out under the noses of German forces who were still actively hunting for Allied troops. Of the approximately 10,000 men of the 1st Airborne Division and Polish Parachute Brigade who had landed near Arnhem, only about 2,000 were successfully evacuated. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured during the 9-day battle. An entire elite division had been effectively destroyed in the failed operation. Major Charles Panther was among the fortunate few who made it out. The evacuation was terrifying, crossing the river in small boats while German patrols searched the banks with flares and searchlights. Men were so exhausted they could barely move, but somehow they found the strength to keep going. We'd lost so many friends, so many good men. The lucky ones were dead. The unlucky ones were prisoners. We were the very lucky ones. We got to go home. Among those who didn't make it out was Sergeant Frank Hughes, the young glider pilot who had fought as infantry for 9 days in Oosterbeek. Hughes was captured by German forces and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war. He would survive, but the experience of Arnhem would haunt him for the rest of his life. The reckoning, Operation Market Garden, officially ended on September 27, 1944. With the withdrawal of the 30th Corps to defensive positions south of the Rhine, the operation had succeeded in liberating much of the southern Netherlands and had captured important bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. But the primary objective, crossing the Rhine and advancing into Germany, had failed completely. The cost had been enormous. Allied casualties totaled approximately 17,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The German defenders had suffered between 7,500 casualties, but they had achieved their primary objective of stopping the Allied advance. More importantly, the failure of Market Garden meant that the war would not end in 1944. The Western Front stabilized along the Dutch and German borders, and both sides began preparing for what would become the final winter of the war. For the Dutch civilians in the occupied territories, this meant months of additional suffering under German occupation, including the terrible hunger winter of 1944-45. Field Marshal Montgomery, the architect of Market Garden, never fully acknowledged the operation's failure. In his memoirs, he claimed that the operation had been 90% successful because most of its objectives had been achieved. But privately, many who had participated in the operation knew better. General James Gavin, of the 82nd Airborne, put it more bluntly. The plan was too ambitious, the timeline was too tight, and the intelligence was wrong. We asked too much of too few people, and when things went wrong, there was no backup plan. It was a bad plan right from the start and right from the top. The human cost, behind the statistics and strategic analysis, lay thousands of individual tragedies. Young men who had volunteered to serve their countries, who had trained for months and years to become elite soldiers, who had already survived multiple campaigns, died in the fields and streets of Holland, pursuing an impossible dream. The families back home received telegrams and letters informing them that their sons, husbands, and fathers were missing in action or had been killed. Many of these families would never know exactly how their loved ones had died, only that they had fallen somewhere in the Netherlands. Flight Officer James Di Pietro, who had survived multiple crash landings during his glider missions, reflected on the human cost of Market Garden years later. We went to Holland full of confidence and hope. We were elite troops, the best trained and equipped forces in the world. We thought we were invincible. But war doesn't care about your training or your confidence. War only cares about luck, and a lot of good men ran out of luck in Holland. The survivors carried their own burden. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many of their friends had died. Others dealt with physical wounds that would never fully heal. All of them carried memories of those 9 days in September that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Lessons in blood. Operation Market Garden became a subject of intense study and debate among military historians and strategists. The operation revealed both the potential and the limitations of airborne warfare, demonstrating that even elite troops could not overcome fundamental flaws in planning and intelligence. The operation's failure highlighted several critical lessons. The importance of accurate intelligence became clear. The presence of German SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem had been reported but dismissed by Allied planners who wanted to believe their own optimistic assessments. The need for reliable communications was demonstrated by the repeated failures of radio equipment that left airborne units isolated and unable to coordinate their actions. Perhaps most importantly, Market Garden showed the dangers of overconfidence and wishful thinking in military planning. The operation had been designed around the assumption that German resistance would be minimal and that everything would go according to plan. Assumptions proved false. There was no contingency plan to fall back on. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, later wrote, "Market Garden was Montgomery's greatest gamble, and when it failed, it cost us dearly. Not just in casualties, though those were terrible enough, but in time and momentum." We could have ended the war in 1944 if we had been more cautious, more realistic in our planning. Instead, we gave the Germans months to prepare their final defenses. The Dutch tragedy. One of the most tragic consequences of Market Garden's failure was its impact on the Dutch civilian population. The operation had raised hopes throughout the Netherlands that liberation was at hand. When the operation failed and Allied forces withdrew south of the Rhine, those hopes were cruelly dashed. The Germans, enraged by Dutch cooperation with the Allied forces, imposed severe reprisals on the civilian population. The hunger winter of 1944-45 was deliberately created by German restrictions on food supplies, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Dutch civilians from starvation and cold. Many Dutch civilians who had helped the Allied forces during Market Garden were arrested and executed. Others were forced to flee their homes and live as refugees in their own country. One Dutch civilian who had sheltered British paratroopers later wrote, "We welcomed the Allied soldiers as liberators as the answer to our prayers. We fed them, hid them, helped them in every way we could, and when they left, the Germans made us pay. My brother was shot, my house was burned, my family was scattered. I don't blame the Allied soldiers. They did their best, but the cost of failure was higher than anyone imagined." Legacy of courage. Despite its ultimate failure, Operation Market Garden left a legacy of incredible courage and sacrifice that continues to inspire military forces around the world. The paratroopers who fought at Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Eindhoven demonstrated the highest traditions of military service, fighting against impossible odds with skill, determination, and honor. The operation also demonstrated the power of international cooperation. American, British, Polish, and other Allied forces fought side by side, unified by their commitment to defeating fascism and restoring freedom to occupied Europe. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Though Market Garden failed, it contributed to the larger Allied victory that would come less than 8 months later. The bridges that the paratroopers died trying to capture would eventually be taken by other Allied forces during the final advance into Germany. The Rhine River, which had seemed like such an insurmountable barrier in September 1944, would be crossed by Allied armies in March 1945. The dream of ending the war quickly had failed, but the dream of victory itself remained alive. Remembrance. Today, throughout the Netherlands, monuments and memorials commemorate the Allied soldiers who fought and died during Operation Market Garden. The bridge at Arnhem, finally captured in April 1945, was renamed the John Frost Bridge in honor of the British colonel who had led the last stand at its northern approaches. Every September, veterans and their families return to the battlefields of Market Garden to remember those who fell. Dutch schoolchildren learn about the operation and place flowers on the graves of Allied soldiers who never made it home. The bonds forged in those desperate September days between Allied soldiers and Dutch civilians continue to this day. Private Jean Metcalfe, who had been captured near Nijmegen and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, returned to Holland for the first time in 1994, 50 years after the battle. He was met by Dutch civilians who remembered the young American paratroopers who had tried to liberate their country. "They treated us like heroes," he said, tears in his eyes. "But we weren't heroes, we were just young men doing our job. The real heroes were the ones who didn't come home." The price of dreams. Operation Market Garden stands as one of history's most poignant examples of the gap between military ambition and battlefield reality. It was conceived in hope and executed with courage, but it founded on the rocks of German resistance and Allied overconfidence. The operation reminds us that in war there are no guaranteed victories, no sure things, no plans that survive first contact with the enemy unchanged. It shows us that even the best soldiers, the most carefully crafted plans, and the noblest intentions can result in failure when the fundamental assumptions prove to be wrong. But Market Garden also reminds us of the extraordinary courage and sacrifice of which human beings are capable when fighting for causes larger than themselves. The paratroopers who jumped into Holland in September 1944 knew they were facing terrible odds, but they jumped anyway. The glider pilots who crash-landed their aircraft behind enemy lines knew they might not survive, but they flew anyway. The ground troops who fought their way up Hell's Highway knew they were racing against time, but they advanced anyway. Their courage failed to achieve its immediate objective, but it succeeded in demonstrating the values for which the Allies were fighting: freedom, democracy, and the refusal to bow to tyranny. Those values ultimately triumphed. Not in September 1944, as Montgomery had hoped, but in May 1945, when Nazi Germany finally surrendered. Operation Market Garden was indeed a bridge too far, a gamble that failed, a dream that turned into a nightmare, an operation that cost thousands of lives in pursuit of an impossible goal. But it was also a testament to the courage of the men who fought it, the civilians who supported it, and the cause for which they all sacrificed so much. As we remember their story, we remember not just the failure of a military operation, but the triumph of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. They remind us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from success, but from the courage to attempt the impossible, even when that attempt ends in defeat.